So it came to pass that after 22 years of living in northern Queensland, with my wife and young family, I journeyed south. I had taken up the offer to manage Benambra House, a general store in the Victorian alpine mining town of Omeo. I arrived in the town in 1909. Less than 50 years after the arrival of the first fleet, squatters crossed the Alps and began to settle the Omeo region. Despite hardships, the settlers persevered and slowly consolidated, and the region began to establish itself as a producer of high-quality cattle. In 1834, a Polish expatriate named Johann Lotsky, a botanist, discovered gold in the Livingston Creek at the town's present location, but his claims fell on deaf ears. It wasn't until 1851 that the Reverend W.B. Clark, a noted geologist, reported that he had found evidence of gold in quantities that would make the mining of it economically feasible. Alluvial deposits of gold were found in tributaries of the Livingston Creek, and by the end of 1854, over 200 men were camped along its banks, digging for gold, most of it being found within a metre or so from the surface. In time, a ramshackle town of calico tents and bark-roofed huts had established itself, with a post office, a store and a pub, the Golden Age, a building made of logs and slabs that served mostly gin and rum that could kick like a horse. The town had no planned streets. They just followed the cart tracks and creeks, and are consequently as crooked as a dog's hind leg to this day. Up one of the creeks and on high ground was the Commissioner's Station. It consisted of a number of huts and tents, a stable and the Omeo log jail built in 1858. It was from here that the Commissioner and his two troopers, one of them Constable Steele, who later was to shoot Ned Kelly, registered claims, issued miners' rights and settled any disputes between miners over land and water. The log jail, I might say, was constantly occupied, for Omeo was undoubtedly the wildest and most lawless gold mining town in Australia. Supplies still had to be brought into the town by packhorse, and it was only in summer months that bullock drays could make the journey. There were no roads, there were no bridges. Loads had to be taken off and reloaded time and time again to enable the team to get through the mud and get up steep inclines. And wheels had to be continually chocked to stop the wagon rolling backwards. The entire trip was hazardous. On the tops of ridges there was always the danger of going over the edge. Some hills were so steep that the only way going down safely was to tie a tree behind to steady the wagon. Creeks and rivers had to be continually crossed, and horses and bullocks had to be rested along the journey, sometimes for days. Among those to arrive on the Omeo goldfield were Chinese miners. They first arrived in 1859. The majority of them had made the long journey over the Alps from Beechworth, many arriving with no more than a pole with a sack at each end slung across their shoulders. I may here tell you that they received a mixed reception. Traders welcomed the possibility of increased patronage the Chinese would bring, but whether it was based on ignorance, whether it was substantiated or not substantiated, the Chinese were viewed with a lot of suspicion by their European miners. Incidents at other goldfields had inferred that they were thieves and liars and could not be trusted. It therefore wasn't long before a Chinese camp similar to those on other goldfields was established at the western edge of the township. Most of the Chinese accepted the camp, and it was only a matter of time before it had Chinese traders and tradesmen, storekeepers, blacksmiths, butchers, bakers, cake shops and opium dens. Even a joss house was built. The camp offered not only local ordinary common food staples, but many Chinese delicacies. And I have to say that their contribution to the community was far greater than most of their European counterparts realised or would admit. By 1855, most of the shallow alluvial gold had been mined, and the process of hydro-sluicing was introduced to the Omeo goldfields. In an operation that took 9 months to complete, a water race was constructed along the mountain slopes for a distance of almost 19 kilometres. Giant flumes crossed gullies and ravines, with the water arriving at about 190 feet above the creek and the alluvial deposits. Races were cut from almost every stream that could supply water. In the process, water blasted away the alluvial gold-containing gravel, and the gravel slush was channeled into rows of wooden sluice boxes, and the gold ore collected. The Oriental Claims area alone produced an estimated 58,000 ounces of gold. At a point when alluvial gold deposits were diminishing, a miner walked into E.J. Johnson's general store, the same store that I later was to own and manage, to cash in some gold. Johnson paid the man his cash, but as he weighed the gold, he noticed something stuck to the pieces of ore. It was quartz. It heralded the beginning of reef mining and a new boom. The first venture into quartz mining was at the Dry Gully field, with the first battery being established on Mountain Creek. People came from all over the district to see a local identity, Miss Rogers, smash a large bottle of champagne over the wheel as it started up and christen it the Mountain Maid. Bullock teams hauled multi-headed batteries up the mountains and across the Alps to work the newfound reefs. Smile of Fortune, Rip Van Winkle, Happy-Go-Lucky, The Joker and Inexhaustible were some of the names given to the many reef mines that opened up. The town, meanwhile, was prospering. Businesses began to establish themselves. Banks arrived. In 1889, the Colonial Bank of Australia. In 1892, the Commercial Bank. A.J. Macdonald, one of the state's leading architects, designed the Post and Telegraph Office and new courthouse. The first school in Omeo was next to my store and charged 1 shilling and 6pence for each child to attend per week, and in its early years was to win many of the state-awarded scholarships at that time. The Omeo Shire's first appointed secretary was Thomas Easton, a formidable and colourful character who had previously served as the region's first justice. Easton was a down-to-earth practitioner with a fearlessly effective reputation in ridding the town of many of its undesirables and those who may have thought that Omeo was a safe haven from justice. In many a court case, if the local constable suggested Easton's verdict was not law, he simply made it law. Such was his manner, such was his reputation, and such was Omeo justice. The town had its own racecourse. It was one of a number that followed in the area and proved to be one of the major attractions for residents throughout the region, many of them putting up their own horses for racing. Horses that worked the week rounding up sheep and cattle often found themselves running for their lives on a Saturday afternoon. Local bookmakers found no shortage of takers amongst the locals. It didn't matter if you knew anything about horses or nothing at all. There was always a bookie only too keen to take your bet. By 1901, Omeo was at its peak, with a population of 9,400. They were prosperous times. People worked hard, miners, timber workers, graziers, but also had time to enjoy the unique lifestyle the high country offered. All aspects of life in a young nation were no different in this faraway, isolated town. The isolation of their situation was made up by a strong community spirit and a deep appreciation of one's neighbour. The main street, Day Avenue, was packed every night with people out strolling, shopping and enjoying the evening air. Hotels and cafes were doing a roaring trade with free-spending miners, and businesses were booming. But let me tell you, it was tough, and ongoing battles against the forces of nature, rain, storms, snow, flooding, fire and drought were all part of life. Bridges were often washed away, mail contractors couldn't get through, the telegraph line was often out of action. On one occasion, the town was completely isolated for 10 days.